The next session is, well, we can get started, I suppose, right? All right. So the next session is going to be on patterns in healthcare. How do we ensure digital reflections help without harm? That's the title. And we are going to have Blythe Adamson, Vin Gupta, Jay Nanduri, and Kayam as participants in this panel. I would like to introduce the moderator for this panel, Sheila O. Sheila has been a faculty member of Seattle University's Computer Science Department since 2014 and directed the Career Change Certificate Program in Computer Science Fundamentals at Seattle University, which is a part-time program that prepares students with no prior computer science background to enter the master's program in computer science. Professor O also serves as the faculty advisor for the Women in Technology Club at Seattle University. So I would like to invite Sheila.
Welcome, everyone. And we're so thrilled to have you all here. And this discussion in terms of patterns in healthcare, how do we ensure digital reflections help without harm? I'm so excited to bring together this group of experts in the field and really just a diverse group of voices that are going to be sharing with us today. And if we don't mind, we can just introduce ourselves. And the first kind of thing was to just kind of talk about the potential of AI in healthcare and what you see ahead of us, what you're most excited about. Would you like to start?
I didn't realize sitting here meant I had to go first, so this is great.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kayam. I'm Principal Counsel at Microsoft, and I support our health AI products as Product Counsel. I'm also involved in our health regulatory and policy efforts. So part of my role is keeping tabs on and figuring out compliance with all the various health regulations that we're seeing in this space. Should we just do introductions, or should I just dive right into?
Go ahead and dive in.
The exciting world of law. You're in for a treat. I recently returned this morning from the American Health Law Association conference. And what we're really seeing in this space is a true patchwork of regulation when it comes to health AI. I'm going to start at the top and work our way down, but really it's the federal government that's doing a lot of interesting things in this space. And I like to think of it as really a trilogy of regulation that we're seeing that has teeth. So the Food and Drug Administration, I think a lot of you are familiar with, has oversight over medical devices. And so far, they've approved close to 900 medical devices. They have marketing clearance, if you will. But all of those are closed systems. When it comes to generative AI, really next evolution of AI, we are expecting a lot of guidance, including predetermined change control plans and total product lifecycle guidance later this year, really showcasing how they're thinking about regulating generative health AI. We also have the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. They got their start. I don't know if the clinicians in the room, you may be familiar with meaningful use, but it's the expectation during the Bush administration that technology is meaningfully used in healthcare. And with that came the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT to certify the technology that would be meaningfully used. And they have oversight over EHRs and what are called certified health IT modules. And they released a rule recently that reflects a steady evolution of the way EHR is regulated, but they introduced this new concept called predictive decision support interventions, which is really another name for AI. And for these predictive DSIs, regardless if it's the EHR developing it or a third party, to the extent there's some embeddedness into the EHR, they need to make certain source attributes available. So things about fairness, external validation, use cases, and other measures. So that's really how they're trying to approach transparency in this space. ONC is also requiring information about risk management and making this available, but not only to ONC, but to users of the technology as well. And the third, part of this trifecta is the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights. You probably know them as the agency that oversees HIPAA, which is a predominant health privacy law in the United States. But the other side, the civil rights side, came out with a rule focused on not discriminating using artificial intelligence tools, or they call it clinical support decision support tools. Mm-hmm. And they are, it mostly deals with clinical tools. While the ONC rules focus on administrative and financial and really all buckets, regardless of use case or risk, AI tools, OCR is really focused on clinical tools. And they have created a proactive obligation to covered entities, which are really providers that receive federal funding to keep track, to have a way of tracking AI tools that could potentially measure protected classes, so race, sex, national origin, and others, and mitigate. OCR and ONC are both requiring mitigation, but they're not really clear in what they're saying, and most of the rules are really punting to the NIST framework that Stephanie talked about. So that's really the big things worth focusing on the federal space. States have been very busy. We have seen over 400 bills at the state level focused on regulating AI and health AI in all sorts of ways. They fall into three categories. The first are bills focused on really privacy. That could have an impact on the data used to potentially train health AI. So the Washington My Health My Data Act is an example. You also have general AI bills. Colorado is a recent one that are really focusing on AI that is industry agnostic. And you lastly have, and none of these have truly passed, but health AI bills that are focused on automation bias, making sure that the clinician is always in the loop and they're not overly relying on AI. The litigators within the government, if you will, have also been busy. The DOJ is investigating a lot of health plans about potentially denying medically necessary things. And the FTC, which has oversight over the non-HIPAA side of health privacy, really consumer health, also has a lot of settlements in the space. I know Blythe will touch on the EU AI Act and everything happening in the EU, but the EU is really, boy, they've been busy. There we have a joke at Microsoft, it's another week, another EU regulation, but they've created this interconnected web, a regulation focused on regulating the digital industry. So things like the Data Act, the Data Governance Act, Digital Markets Act. But one component of it that was recently adopted is the EU AI Act that takes a risk classification system to regulating AI, and they focus on both AI systems as a whole and also general purpose AI, which is really another name for foundation models. I won't regale you with the state of the rest of the laws, but really that's the big patchwork that we're seeing. And so when it comes to AI in this space and health AI, and really when it comes to really anything in healthcare, you can't operate in a vacuum. You're always sort of moving with the winds of regulation. So I think it's important to also frame our discussion and keep tabs on what's going on from a regulatory standpoint.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Vin.
That's very comprehensive. So I'm Vin Gupta. I'm a pulmonologist at Virginia Mason, and on the tech side, I'm a chief medical officer over at Amazon Health, and I focus on our pharmacy business and some of our device work. And I love the interplay because it allows me to see what we still do in the four walls of an ICU, and then to zoom out and see what Amazon's trying to do when it comes to, say, improving the navigation experience for a patient that comes to Amazon.com with a healthcare intent to say, you know, I have pink eye, give me help, or I need something. And so I think that's going to be my jumping off point, and just to share some perspectives as a clinician, whether we're talking about AI or just digital tech more broadly. What I've noticed, and where I think we're just touching the surface on, from a clinical lens, is embedding, and you touched a little bit on this, artificial intelligence tools directly within Epic and Cerner and directly within the EHR workflow. And so we're trying to do a little bit of it on the search side of it at Amazon, where if somebody has healthcare intent, we can provide them actual meaningful navigation to a healthcare service, whether it's ours, whether it's somebody else's, that we understand about 8% of searches at Amazon are healthcare intent. How do we get them the services they need as quickly as possible, useful information? More broadly though, when we think about healthcare systems, what we're doing up the hill at Virginia Mason, elsewhere, how do we make the Epic experience? We're about to onboard onto Epic at VM. How do we leverage AI tools in a way that clinicians will actually utilize them? I think, you know, I've been at 1,000,001 health technology conferences over the last year, and everybody loves to talk about the next point solution that may be AI enabled or not. And the issue is that all these digital health tools, whether they're AI enabled or not, most of them do not ever get downloaded and get utilized within the clinical workflow of somebody that utilizes Epic. And then what does that mean? If there is actual patient-facing value from that tool, that patient doesn't experience or get any benefit from the latest, greatest innovation. So what are we seeing when it comes to clinical decision support tools? WebMD 2.0 or UpToDate 2.0 that goes beyond say I have a 65-year-old patient with shortness of breath, if I were to type that into WebMD or Google or UpToDate, I would get a binary search, I would get a set of results on the back end that talks about shortness of breath. Something that is maybe tangentially related to what's actually happening in front of me with my patient. What we're seeing now, and Epic is historically been difficult to work with, just in all candor, from my experiences at least, is that they have decided that this is something that they have to it's in their business interest and in their future sustainability to actually have a clear play here. So we have our friends from Microsoft obviously working closely with them. But what are we seeing? We're actually seeing within the search window for a provider that's utilizing Epic at, say, the University of Pittsburgh, that there's AI tools embedded in the workflow. If somebody presses a button, they can have their 15-minute note transcribed, which we know. I think that's sort of version 1 of what a clinician may utilize a generative AI platform for, better transcribing of notes. But version 2 is happening at places like the University of Pittsburgh right now, which is I press another button and I can get a pre-templated differential diagnosis of what's happening with my patient, 65-year-old with shortness of breath. It's going to take in any labs that were drawn on that specific day, put it into the foundation model. Any subjective complaints that the patient told me in our 15-minute visit, it's going to put it into the foundation model. X-ray images, EKGs, put it into the foundation model. And then basically take these multimodal data points and spit out a differential diagnosis that mimics what a doctor thinks. Me as a pulmonologist, what would I think? And give me a probabilistic outcome of here's what's happening from most likely to least likely, and then even pre-template a treatment plan. That's where we're headed. Before, maybe 3 months ago, you had to minimize the window of Epic, open up a different web browser, go to an AI platform or ChatGPT or something like it, and try to play around with it and say, hey, I have a patient with this set of complaints and these findings, what's going on? Now we're actually seeing that these tools are embedded within the direct clinical workflow of a provider. And that matters. I think it's easy to say it, but that matters a lot because there's 101 applications that you can download as a provider to augment your experience as a clinician and hopefully derive value to the patient. But now we're saying, you know what, we're going to customize these tools for specific health systems, and we're going to make that experience automatically better. I think that is a leaps and bounds improvement on where we were just 6 months ago. So AI for clinical decision support, directly integrated within the Epic ecosystem as one example. We're already seeing examples of that.
Sure.
It is, well, so it's all within sort of an IRB study right now. So we're looking at, the company that's doing it with Epic is doing a prospective trial on it. So it's within the boundaries of an IRB study. So right now it's not actually, it's protected under the clauses of IRB.
Thank you. Blythe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's just a delight to be here, and I've loved the conversations that we've had so far. My name is Blythe Adamson. I'm the head of outcomes research and evidence generation at a health tech company in New York called Flatiron Health. And the mission of our organization is to learn from the experience of people with cancer to improve patient lives. And we do that in a few different ways. One is that we have an EHR software used in community cancer clinics across the US. And another part of our business is curating and learning from electronic medical records to make research-ready, de-identified data sets to be able to answer questions like comparing the effectiveness of 2 different cancer treatments to each other, being able to generate real-time intelligence for the FDA about the safety and effectiveness of medicines. And most recently and exciting, we've expanded now to include EHR data from the UK, Germany, and Japan, where now we're having so many learnings about how to generate real-time evidence. And Flatiron as a company has existed for about 10 years. And traditionally, the process of being able to learn with the clinical depth necessary to understand safety and effectiveness of drugs is that so much of the important information and details are trapped within the unstructured data. So within paragraphs of text and clinical narratives, through PDFs that are scans of faxes that have been sent through with lab reports and information. And for many years, we used the technique of having an army of more than 1,000 oncology nurses opening up charts manually and pulling out this information. And it was only, several years ago that we really started using all of this data to start training deep learning models to be able to read through patients' charts with the same accuracy as our human experts. And what we found really is of what this now unlocks, the application of AI in being able to generate real-time intelligence about how well drugs are working, is really been in the speed, the clinical depth, and the scale with which we're able to do it. So after many, many years of having nurses go through and open up charts, we had only been able to curate hundreds of thousands of patient records. And once we started to build and develop and train and deploy deep learning models and now LLM models into production, we are able to learn from more than 4 million cancer patients in a fraction of the time with the same level of rigor and accuracy. And so just to bring this to light, what does this practically mean? Recently the FDA had a question that surfaced about a cancer drug that was on the market, where they really had a signal that maybe in a subgroup of patients with a specific biomarker status, that this drug may actually be worse off for a subgroup of patients that it was broadly indicated for. And so at first we went through the manual way. We were looking for anyone who had a positive result for a KRAS biomarker and looked through 70,000 records of people who had lung cancer. And this took us more than 4 months to manually go through. And as soon as we finished, then the FDA figured out, it's actually within that group a specific G12C mutation that we need. So then there's this dilemma. Do you spend 4 more months going through 70,000 charts again? Or can you deploy a model to do the same thing in less than a day to be able to get that same information? And we were able to, in less than a day, deploy a model and identify all of the patients within the 70,000 lung cancer patients who had used this drug, who had this mutation, and in real time be able to describe for the FDA if this drug was appropriate to be using in this group. So it saved more than 3,000 hours of nurses' time to be able to find this information and to be able to help this group. So I just wanted to give that illustrated example. We're happy to talk later about the point of care decision tools, which we've also have developed and validated retrospectively and prospectively. But really overall, I'm just so thrilled that there are, I think, tangible, low-risk opportunities for AI to be able to improve the timeliness, the depth of information, and our access to be able to generate intelligence in real time. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Jay?
Hello, thank you for having me. I think my connection here is in our company, there are a few Seattle U grads, and also my daughter is a Seattle U alum. Thanks for having me here. My name is Jay Nanduri. I'm a Chief Technical Officer and co-founder for Truveta, a local startup based in Bellevue. Prior to that, I enjoyed a 21-year at Microsoft, where I worked primarily in Bing first, and after that I worked in industries like financial systems and supply chain industry, focusing primarily on big data and AI. So, and in 2020, when we are at the peak of the curve that's starting for the pandemic, that's when we started Truveta. And for me, the meaningful reason why I wanted to found this company is because we just went through our family with my side of the parents and my wife's side of the parents both had some rare diseases or cancer and they died, and it was such a deep thought for me that I need to do something in the healthcare industry. So that's what we started. So Truveta is a company with our vision of saving lives with data. I'm a data guy, and I have seen data in other industries and healthcare. I can tell you, it's very hard to work with healthcare data. Okay, the reason is because there are so many reasons. There's regulatory, there's a privacy. It's a very sensitive data, and we are created by 30 health systems that created Truveta, and one of the leading members is Providence, which is a block away from here, which is the own Swedish hospitals. And what the goal of ours was, because we were created in pandemic, all these 30 health systems were looking for data to be able to treat COVID. There was an adversary called COVID, and they were trying to look up for all the data, and there's no single system was available enough to give that real-time data to what to do with it. So that's where our journey started. And so we always focus on bringing the data from all these 30 health systems in a unified way into our platform. And what we promise for for the researchers, the main customers of our platform is clinical researchers that are working in a life science and pharma, or the life science, or the clinical researchers that are working in the healthcare systems, that are working on care pathway research and things like that. So we interface our platform with them, and our platform actually provides a consistent way they can look at the patient regardless of which health system it came from. And what is the most exciting thing that we see from our customers is, regardless of where the data came from, the quality and the way they can feel the data is the same. That's what they say. In my early 1 year, I had a chance to talk to couple of clinical researchers from Fred Hutch, and there was one individual. He had a tears in eyes. He said, "Hey, I've been 2 years. I've been searching for some patients for my research," and then I said that, okay, if Truveta can give you in 2 clicks or 3 clicks, that's where it is, because people do not need to wait for requiring the data to be able to do their research to find the cures. So that's where we are kind of very passionate about. And what AI excites about us is, if you look at this data comes in, as I said, healthcare data is very difficult to work with. It has different formats. And when doctors like Win are actually treating the patient, their primary thing is to save the patient, not to save the record. Okay? So that's why the records are always not complete, you know what I mean? And they're processed for different reasons, for billing reasons or anything like that, because of which the clinical accuracy of the data tries to die down or get suppressed. So that's where actually we come in, and we try to take the structured and unstructured components of the data of the EHR that Blythe was talking about, and we try to analyze them with AI and ML. And I can tell you, I can compare and contrast. The reason I enjoy this industry is because of the 2 reasons. In the previously, I was working with AI and data and everything for purposes of a capitalistic dreams or everything. Here we work of saving lives. That's what actually gives me that intense pleasure. And when we work with any of these clinical researchers, they're looking for a specific outcome they're trying to drive for, and they're looking for a specific data. How can we give the data that is representative? You know what I mean? So that there's no bias in the data and things like that. And all this we could do today, I can tell you thanks to AI, because most of the models that process this data in a less than an hour. So that's why we're able to give yesterday's data today. And during the pandemic, one of our customers actually was able to use our data to be able to look at the adverse reactions of the drugs that are happening and things like that. So that's the most, I would say that exciting thing.
Thank you all. So I'm going to transition a little bit, and there's a lot of players in this field, and a lot of experts in tech and healthcare and law, and you might almost think there's almost too many cooks in the kitchen. And with this, that you see some issues, right? You see, for instance, someone that might be an expert in tech that's actually building these models. They may actually unknowingly distance themselves from the actual lived experiences of the patients and may be solving for the wrong thing. Or there might be a clinician who kind of sees AI as a silver bullet and trusts the output, even putting their own intuition and medical training aside. And so one thing that I want the group to answer is just kind of, how do we actually kind of see either your companies or collectively kind of working towards this common goal, right? And how do we improve this patient care and do least harm? And how do you think that the field really still needs to grow in this respect? Does anybody want to start?
Happy to start, and I should give you the caveat that I'm speaking on my own behalf as a healthcare attorney and not, the viewpoint of Microsoft, which Stephanie brings over here. I think the difficulty that I'm seeing, both from a regulatory and industry standpoint, is to truly define AI. We see a lot of definitions that are broad strokes that are trying to boil this complex universe to truly try to regulate it. But whether they capture the nuance that exists in AI is I think, yet to be seen. We're heavily relying on the definition from the recent executive order on AI, which again, very broad strokes. It captures both predictive AI and generative AI, and as you all know, the machinery underneath really changes the risks and the challenges of this technology. I think that's some of the difficulty here, where I think the complexity isn't quite translating across the various players, or the cooks in the kitchen, if you will.
Yeah. I would just add that from the clinical standpoint, there's just so much opportunity for improvement in what we do at the point of care. And so take what happened in 2023, 100,000 people. This happens on average every single year, but about 100,000 people died as a result of misdiagnosis. Obviously, well-intentioned care, but there was misdiagnosis for whatever reason, multifactorial. So when I think about current state in medicine, and everybody has a riff on what's wrong with the US healthcare system, but when you talk to patients, when you talk to providers, when you see the realities of where we're headed towards 2030, a supply-demand mismatch, not enough physical human beings to care for the oldest society on record by 2030. And then when you're dealing with these misdiagnoses, these numbers, six-figure numbers, I'd rather take the optimistic view that there's so much white space and room for improvement in what we can do at the point of care that we're going to learn. There's so many unknowns. I don't think there is an answer, and nobody has the definitive answer to your question. Are people going to over-rely on clinical decision support tools? I hope not. But the truth is, there's clinical decision support tools today that are not that fantastic that we over-rely on. UpToDate, WebMD, Google. And so if we're going to replace that with something that I think is slightly better, and again, to the question that was asked of me earlier, a lot of this is being done within the auspices of prospective clinical trials under IRB. I should have qualified that. Because there are going to be FDA guidelines here on what can or cannot be embedded within the EHR. That's going to pre-template a differential diagnosis. Let's say we get past all that, though. To me, the optimistic view, and we have to take the optimistic view because the current state is so darn suboptimal, is let's hope that people use their common sense and augment it with a better tool. Yeah. And if that's not the reality that we're headed towards, then we'll wrestle with it. But there's so much room for improvement, and we're not doing things correctly today.
Yep, Vin and I were just in Aspen together with the Tool Go On Day, and one of the things that he said was that he doesn't think that doctors are going to be replaced with AI. They're going to be replaced by doctors who know how to use AI. And I think a parallel quote that we keep hearing is that 80% of jobs will be able to gain 20% efficiency. And to connect that back to something Ty was saying about the European Union's new AI Act framework, they have this pyramid of minimal risk, low risk, all the way up to high risk or unacceptable risk applications. And I think it is important for us to map out all these different use cases according to that scale. Because my expectation is that we're going to see adoption and utilization of the minimal risk use cases first, and the slowest, longest time to adoption of the high risk use cases. And the regulatory framework really is that the things that are the highest risk, where risk is defined by what if you get it wrong, what's the chance that a patient will be harmed? That's where the most regulatory oversight is going to happen and should be happening. But really, there are a lot of quick wins where we can gain efficiencies in our healthcare system in lots of practical jobs, even whether it's administrative billing or many different applications where I think we'll see just lots of small incremental gains in efficiencies of our system.
Yeah. In my perspective in this, as you said, there are many different constituencies, whether you look at from the health systems or caregivers or whether you talk about payers. There are several players in this ecosystem, and there's a lot of research that happens. There's a lot of thing happens. I'm a data guy. So what we look at is when somebody is building a solution, an AI or anything, they look at, if you look at, there are so many companies, they look at a single path. You can see that there are a lot of companies that are doing imaging-based AI. There's a lot of companies that are doing the next best action, things like that. So what we are actually, at Truveta, what we are focusing on is bring the data together so that there is a 360 degrees of the data of the patient that is available. And when you get this real-time feedback that is coming, then you can actually create these models, your pseudo models, that actually can run and look at, even if a clinical researcher has an idea and they wanted to actually take a hypothesis and actually run with it, how can they actually explore these hypotheses before they actually can go and materialize them? This is where exactly we spend a lot of kind of an energy on. The second thing is, if you look at in healthcare, this is another thing that I find interesting because I came from another industry, right? So other industries is always in healthcare, there are multiple parties, but a lot of innovation happens between two parties in equations. So for example, if you look at, there's a lot of innovation that happened in the insurance payers and the healthcare, and how exactly the claims data is transferred to the life science and customers. Healthcare systems are giving data, but there is a cycle here. When patient is going to the doctor, and the doctor is, because of which we are doing some tests, we're generating the data, and the data is going through the life science, and the life science is doing a clinical research, and it is actually patient is being involved. And this cycle, when I look in the stay back and look at it, wow, there is a cycle. How can leverage? How can we actually close the loop here so that the care can be given, measured, and exactly that's where the opportunity is, and I think that's where all these parties that are in this ecosystem need to work, because that's what I can tell. Because if you look at in the financial industry, they have an adversaries called, whether it's the fraudsters or the money launderers, and there is a single enemy, and they're actually fighting against, all come together and fight against us. We have a common adversary. It's a death or a disease, okay? Why can't all these parties come together and create these models that can be validated through? And this is where exactly there lies, I see that in 20, 25 years from now, and we're in an amazing time of where AI has taken that, the growth curve, and with the, generative AI and LLMs, we are able to query faster. We are able to get the knowledge, assimilate the knowledge faster. And with this collaborations happening, I think it's a pretty exciting future that we are in.
So let's transition to talk a little bit about data, right? We've talked a little bit about how the models are only as good as the data that we provide, but the data has a lot of gaps. Dr. London mentioned that a lot of the genomic databases are predominantly white and European. We know that women were not required by law to be parts of clinical trials until 1993. That's so recent. There are certain populations, for instance, the trans population, the indigenous population, that are just completely underrepresented. So one thing that we can think about here is that AI is not going to create systematic bias, but it will still be based on whatever data is actually fed in. And we can't necessarily cure racism and systematic oppression overnight, but what can we do about this idea of bias? And in this case, I have two kind of questions in terms of, first, how do we define what an average patient is? And what challenges emerge when another patient becomes an outlier or kind of a deviation from this average? How do we ensure that AI will catch these health problems comprehensively? And relatedly, what does it mean if different systems are taking different approaches to this problem? Is that a benefit or a challenge? And what is needed to make sure that we are continuing to examine and refine this question of equity rather than programming in one solution and assuming that's sufficient? Does anybody want to start?
I'd love to just drop a little spicy challenge here and say, I don't think our our clinical trials are representative either.
Oh, yeah, I know.
So, all these randomized controlled trials where we're trying to understand if where drugs work, they're in cherry-picked, predominantly white populations of healthy individuals where you expect the drugs will work the best.
Yeah.
So I think that there's incredible opportunities now for understanding the safety and best healthcare among populations that have been historically marginalized from clinical trials. The older and the sicker patients are ones that, have been, there's reasons through clinical trial design, they have been historically excluded from these things. So I think now there's something new that's opened from an ethical lens about what responsibility do we have now in understanding what treatments work well in populations that have been historically excluded, that now AI is giving us the scale and visibility into learning from.
Yeah.
I want to add a little bit, right? See, like what you started saying that any AI model is as good as the data that it has, it's trained on. And if the product of the AI will have a bias if the data has bias in it, you know what I mean? So bias typically comes through two lenses. One thing is there's a collection bias, you know what I mean? Because your data itself, the way you're collecting from and the way you're giving it to this AI model or the model training, it could be biased. That's number one. And number two is the population that you're looking at could be biased. This is where the person or the individual that is doing the research, how are they actually picking this population? And this could be biased because of, just like what Blythe said, there are many clinical trials which are not representative, which is because maybe the collection, the data that they need, required data that is required to run the trial probably is not there. That's why they're picking whatever is the best that is available in the data. So this is what we see, because anytime we work with any of our life science customers, that's what we look for is, hey, we give out of the box certain kind of a bias, detection logic when they actually generate their cohorts or populations. Because one thing that I have learned very, very quickly after, starting in healthcare is in any other place, you can actually look at it what is an average for an individual, average for an entity. In healthcare, it's a fallacy because we are all different from each other, okay? The whole population is heterogeneous. And there is only, you can find certain populations that actually behave like one or act like one. So that's why most of the time, the clinicians are asking, hey, show me more patients like mine, okay? Whether they're matching with certain kind of parameters. And I came from Bing, right? And we used to see a lot of health-related queries. It used to be 8%, and guess what? In 2020, the query percentage was 44%, obviously. COVID is going on. So even if you look at, when you query for this particular element of the data that you are going in, the way the query parameters actually have written, where exactly the data is going for. So those are the kind of elements we need to carefully look at in creating this element. See, most of the time people say that, hey, if there is an AI model in the car, do you think it will have bias? It's going to hit a white person more than some other race or gender? It's not, It depends on what kind of data that we have given, what kind of data that we have supplied to this car, you know what I mean, that it is designing the algorithm in. So that's why we need to take an utmost amount of care to be able to give that well-rounded representative data to the algorithms. You know what I mean? So that's where the crux of the thing is, because all these models are in the end a digital form of the healthcare that is happening. I know in the healthcare we have this null hypothesis, do no harm, and that null hypothesis, when you need to apply to the nth degree, you need to have a very vast representative data on which the models could be trained.
I would just add, first of all, I completely agree with both the perspectives. And Blythe, just to build on what you were saying, and to your question, what's the average patient? I will say, as a lung doc, it's interesting. this is complete, it'll seem completely tangential to this conversation, but you'll get what I'm saying in a second. If anybody's had a pulmonary function test ever done, or loved ones have ever had it done, it's those tests, what's considered normal are a normal range of values for your lung volumes is actually a 6 foot white male is the standard by which we define what is a normal sized lung. And that depends on, and the size of your lungs, it depends on how tall you are. And so it's interesting that, if we have somebody that does not look like that get lung volumes, and we're comparing it to a normal that's very defined by specific guardrails and demographics, it completely throws off what's normal for one individual doesn't make sense for what's normal for another individual. And what we define as normal is, in the world of pulmonology and lung volumes, is based on a 6 foot tall white male. Just to say that there is the standard definition of what is an average patient doesn't exist, and it doesn't make sense. And there's clinical protocols and range of normal values in diagnostic practice that are based on one demographic that have no application to another demographic. When it comes to generative AI and all these clinical decision support tools, I don't think we've solved for that. I do think that there's an ability to rapidly improve the amount of data that goes in to be more diverse, to be more representative, and I do believe that we're reaching that goal more quickly than, say, enrolling a prospective clinical trial that takes a lot longer to ensure adequate diversity. What I'm, I guess where I would say, when we think about the immediate implications of, for example, the EPIC example, I really think we're in a teaching institution. The best near-term example of AI is it's going to allow our trainees to ask the better questions, to be better, hopefully, diagnosticians, but to ask the right upfront questions to the patient, regardless of their demographics, but to be better diagnosticians, more accurate. And yes, maybe presentations will vary based on unique demographic characteristics, but I think that's going to be the question here. There's no average patient. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. That's actually, that's been the whole problem with our range of normal values for a range of diagnostics. There just isn't one application that is true for 10 different types of patients. But if we can ask the right questions, if we can make sure we're forming the right differential diagnosis, then I think at least we're going to be a little bit fairer to the person right in front of us.
I would also love to add from where I sit, I think there's two fundamental difficulties in solving for bias. The first is there's no uniform way to assess bias. It differs by organization, differs by use case. There's just nothing standardized out there. The other is, and really this is the state of the privacy laws in the United States and globally right now, where there is just a lot of difficulty in accessing some of this data, even if it's de-identified, and particularly if it sort of falls outside the traditional healthcare systems. I think consumer health, your Fitbits or your Apple Watches, if you will, that do collect a lot of useful data, but the ability to truly harness that data and solve a lot of AI problems is you're dealing with a patchwork of state privacy laws. I think, if I was the betting person, I think there is going to be a reckoning at some point between AI development in healthcare and privacy laws. And I think the impetus of that is health equity. I think we talked a lot about needing representative data, preventing the digital divide, but also add that within healthcare, there's a long and storied history of improperly impacting marginalized populations, whether it's the HeLa cell Tuskegee experiment, and what is data or health AI but another potential means of exploitation. So I think when we're sort of solving for that, we have to sort of keep that in mind, where there's two sides to this equation. We of course want representative data, want to prevent the digital divide, but we also want to make sure that we are still doing good and we're not doing harm to populations that have historically suffered a lot of harm. Yeah.
And I think that one thing that we think about in terms of this, there are certain populations that we've talked about that are underrepresented, but have also been harmed, right? And have, in a way, a lack of trust in health systems or even in technology. And so, when I think about trust, I think about this idea of building a relationship, about access to information, and this idea of having a history of positive kind of interactions or personal kind of, for instance, with my physician, I have a 10-year history with them And so when I was pregnant and was told to take the COVID vaccine, I trusted them to take the COVID vaccine, even though there wasn't a lot of information about it. And so I am, talking in this kind of form of, I am in a sense of privilege where I've had this, history where, my mom was a nurse, my brother's a surgeon, that I understand that, I can trust medicine, but not all populations, have this kind of privilege or have had kind of histories of kind of oppression. So how can we leverage AI to increase this trust? And are there aspects of AI that can threaten, and if so, how can we get ahead of them?
I have an opinion on this.
Yes,
Again,
please.
my own thoughts, not affiliated with Microsoft. I think there is a graveyard of technology that exists because there's lack of trust. And I think to truly build trust, you need guardrails, rules, regulations. And I think, you don't want it to be so stringent that it's minimizing innovation, but you need a framework in which I can say, I feel comfortable going and using this tool. I feel comfortable taking my daughter and allowing her to sort of interact with this tool. I think that is the structure that we need and the structure that we're missing. And half the difficulty is, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Moore's law about, the exponential growth of technology. There's a joke that generative AI makes Moore's law look like a casual walk in the park. It's evolving at a very rapid pace, and for even guardrails that exist or regulators to keep up, it's just not right now doable. And I'm not truly sure how to solve for that, but that's, I think, the current state of affairs right now.
Any other opinions?
Well, I guess I'll throw it to Blythe after I finish. I would say that patients are coming in and their search queries on Google now are augmented by generative AI, and this happened in the last 4 weeks. We've seen that it gives you an AI summary of whatever you're searching for: congestive heart failure, should I take X supplement, whatever it is, and it strikes me that it's much more decisional. If I say, should I be taking vitamin B12, what version of it? It's gonna give a much more decisional, high intent result to a high intent search. Like, hey, this is what you should do in the summary statement, versus just link you to Wikipedia or Medline or something like that, which was the experience 4 weeks ago. And so I worry that patients are going to come into their primary care physician or to their pulmonary clinic much more hardened in their beliefs, and it could be right or wrong, but there's going to be a decisional aspect to how people search for medical information. Most of them search, 30% of Americans get it through Google, and now it's been augmented with generative artificial intelligence. And we hope that means better informed patients seeking out science-based healthcare services. But I think that a lot of that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think some of the ways that I've seen building great AI tools work out well is when you have all of these different stakeholder perspectives at the table with equal respect for each other. So an example of companies that have failed that I've seen are ones that have a bunch of clinicians together where they know the real problem in the workflow, and then they just talk down to a group of software engineers and say, build this for me. This is the tool that we really need. And then another company might have, I'm not referring to, I didn't mean to hand gesture to Truveta, a hypothetical company may have a bunch of software engineers and they think, I'm going to solve this. I'm guessing that this is probably a really big problem. And then they build something really complex and there's no clinician, no care providers that have any time to give them input on it. And both of those, it never turns out well. Where I've seen great work and great AI tools built for purpose is beginning by listening to patients, understanding and listening to providers in that clinical workflow. And then having teams where, at one conference room table, you have a clinician and a nurse and a software engineer and a data scientist, an epidemiologist, a product manager. You really have to have all of these groups working together with equal respect for each other's voices. And I think that's the hope we have and is necessary to even be able to design things so that we can understand bias, build in mitigation plans, build continuous bias monitoring tools. So I do think there's hope, but it is hard. And it means that all of our functions, every single person here in this room, the skills that we're trying to build to be able to do this together, a lot of it is effective communication skills and learning how to speak each other's languages so that we can build solutions as teams.
Yeah, I'll add one thing on the fun side of it. So one of my close friends is a doctor, and I tell him that, hey, tell me how your job has kind of changed in the last 10, 15 years. And he says that, hey, previously my appointments were much more smaller. And when Google came along, the patient comes with a list of questions that they have read up on the Google. And they'll ask me about all different kind of issues that they have seen on the web for the symptoms that they have. And now they are almost asking, I asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT tells me, I may have this, okay, how confident are you about, this diagnosis? So he says that first he needs to walk the patient back from, where exactly he or she, came from. So I think the trust, as you can see, there are, any trust needs a framework, okay? Between human beings, what is the framework? If A doesn't surprise B and B doesn't surprise A, the trust establishes. In the same way, between the systems and between all the parties within the ecosystem, there needs to be a framework. You know what I mean? I think you have seen in the previous conversation that there's a responsible AI has this set of 6 elements. I came from Microsoft when responsible AI was part of the journey. So that's why I'm using that example. Those 6 were giving you as a framework what are the things that you can check for, so that whatever you're producing is trustworthy, and you're able to tell that, hey, on these 6 axes, I made sure that whatever I'm producing is safe. Okay. In that way, I think whether it's regulators or anything, that framework needs to come through, and that framework needs to come through all the constituents of the system. Otherwise, what happens is one constituent says, okay, we don't trust it. Even if a big research came through and payer is not paying for it, I don't think a clinician can use that kind of a technique or anything like that. So that's why an overarching framework where everybody works together, and that framework will have things for bias, how exactly you check for certain underrepresented, populations, and everything, all things happen with. That's kind of my perspective.
So I think that we talk about this idea of checks and balances, and that we actually need to have some idea that it's not just that this system works, but it's actually doing something that's better, right? If it's just going to be completely the baseline of a human could do the exact same thing, then what is the point, right? So it's a matter of improvement, right? That's what we're really looking for.
Is it always for improvement?
Well, I think ideally, yeah. I mean, hopefully not worse, right? And so, and I think that one thing that you mentioned, Vin, was that I think the next generation actually needs to be trained, right? And so, maybe one thing that I was thinking about is this something that we would actually have in medical schools? That doctors will need to actually know how to use AI responsibly. I think that the other kind of idea here is that we know that AI is not just going to be a replacement, right, for doctors, but how can it actually be used as a tool to support them in the most effective way?
Sure. Well, I'm happy to start. I don't think it's the question we often get is the end goal of Amazon, or you name the institution, to replace a primary care physician with an AI chatbot? And I'm not a lawyer, but I would suspect having practicing within our medical legal framework, there is no way we're going to allow AI to displace a human being. It's going to, at least in the near term, it'll augment. That's my hope. So I hope improve, but I think, Blythe, you're raising you're right to point out and to push on that. I was going to take a slightly different place. Today, I don't know if you saw the press release from some manufacturer, but that the GLP medications were going to disrupt the CPAP market. I don't know, maybe some of you saw that press release in the last few days, because turns out if you solve for obesity, Obesity-related complications also start to go away, like obstructive sleep apnea. I saw that. I was asked to comment on it, and it was frustrating to me because I feel like the pharmaceutical companies continue to churn out all these precision medicine tools like GLPs, which I think is a precision medicine tool. Other expensive drugs that few people can access, and then they're funding all these clinical trials and doing all this media on it to draw attention to, hey, look at this amazing thing that treats everything, and oh, by the way, you can't have access to it because our list price is 10 times higher than any other country. But oh, by the way, it's solving the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And it's obvious. I think it's obvious to us in the clinical world, to all these experts here, it's obvious. So what's the intent here? The intent here is to force Medicare and all our commercial payers to pay for it. And the problem is it's not sustainable. So what do we do? And I think that we can talk about clinical decision support tools for providers, what this means for the search query experience for patients in Google. But really, what does it mean for payers? And how do we, I'm not trying to have the back of insurance companies. I have no conflict there with insurance companies. But I do think the question has to be raised. We have Alzheimer's drugs that are extremely expensive. We have gene therapy for cancer. We have the next GLP. This is the world that we live in, precision medical tools without precision benefits. And how do we use AI to identify the subsegment of patients and a large employers to say, yes, I'm going to give that group of patients access to this next latest, greatest innovation, because you know what? It's going to be good for them. It's actually going to save us costs downstream because it's going to prevent a hospitalization. But how do we pair benefits and stagger benefits in a way that allows for precision benefits for this era of precision medicine tools? There's got to be a discussion on that because we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not going to be fiscally sustainable. And we, by the way, as taxpayers are funding this whole thing. We funded the initial research on GLPs, and it's a broader question on public-private good. Is this a public good? Is it a private good? I don't know. We're not going to solve it here. But I think we have to use AI to forecast who needs access the most to X therapeutic and give them access to it now to create at least a fiscally sustainable model, because right now nobody has access.
So I'll set this up to argue that I think the greatest innovation, motivated for that reason, is going to happen outside the United States. Because in the US, we have this fragmented payer system, we don't really have a bulk negotiator besides CMS now for the top 10 most expensive drugs that is motivated to produce that type of evidence to be able to negotiate. So one, I think it's going to happen in countries that have limited healthcare resources. Those are going to be some of the places where we see the application of AI in innovative ways well before the United States comes and starts using them. So it will be really interesting 5 years from now to look back and say, what was the country of origin for some of the greatest tools that are available? And I think the mix that we're going to see is the tools that come out of the US are going to look very different than the tools that came out of South Africa. Because when you have limited resources or not enough primary care providers, I think that this is a really exciting moment to see where the lower and middle income countries are going to start applying AI in healthcare because the rest of the high income world isn't solving their problems.
Can I add something?
Oh, sure.
So in the COVID world, one thing that surprised me was, did you know that that's what I learned is that the COVID vaccines, when they were produced, they were not produced on any of the US-based patients. They were from a different country. But at the time of the emergency, when people are dying left and right, we had an emergency authorization, everything. We cut everything and we said that, hey, this particular drug, let's approve emergency authorization, and then we did more trials on kind of a US-based population and everything. I think that's what the crux is. You know what I mean? I think if the ecosystem actually has to be accepting, and there needs to be checks and balances, and that's when I think we can create an ecosystem. Maybe I'm 3.5 years into the healthcare industry. I should be. Sometimes that's what. Whenever we are having a conversation, we don't work with payers because one of our philosophies that we don't let our data access by anybody who discriminate patients. So because of which today we don't work with any payers, and we only work with researchers. And most of the time we have this argument is, hey, if this particular procedure has come in, they say that in the care pathway, hey, insurance is not going to accept, okay? But everything was okay when things were going haywire. So I think humanity doesn't need to come to that point, but there needs to be some checks and balances and regulatory bodies. Everybody needs to come together. That's that.
Just to clarify one point, though. So as someone who worked at the White House and was part of Operation Warp Speed, we did test the COVID vaccines on U.S. patients. Yes, and was really innovative in how Operation Warp Speed applied machine learning to accelerate those trials and identify patients in the U.S. among the hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. who did stand up and volunteer to want to be part of those trials. Part of the ways that Operation Warp Speed, in a coordinated effort led by the government, with the pharma industry, used machine learning tools to help surface to the clinic coordinators at these recruiting sites which patients were most likely to be exposed to COVID and develop symptomatic disease, and therefore, reach the endpoints faster for trials. So I think that the US actually had quite a big victory in the application of machine learning for COVID vaccines.
The point I was making there was when I read few books from Eric Topol and this medical reversal and everything, US has this 17-year problem. When a problem is found when a care pathway or a cure is given to the patient, there is almost a 17-year gap. But whereas the point I was making is we took some shortcuts, like what you said, this innovative ML technology or whatever you used to test it on the US population, that was done as a shortcut. Am I correct? So those are the kind of things that needs to happen. That's the point I was making.
So we are at our final question, which is, what opportunities have we not yet plumbed with AI in healthcare, and where do we want to go next? And how can cross-disciplinary conversations and formal partnerships move us forward to these goals and away from any pitfalls?
I can start. Because I have this perspective, I think I'll repeat, is because of the coming other industries, right? In the life cycle, the point I was earlier making, there's a patient, there is a physician, there is a payer, life science, pharma, clinical trials, ARO, and it comes close back to the patient. This is a life cycle of anything that goes through, care pathway, medication, any procedure, everything goes through. But most of the communication or protocols are between two parties. Okay, that is something that I see. If I look at in a financial industry or supply chain industry, there are so many open protocols, okay, that were created so that there is a multi-party assessment can be performed or anything. In healthcare, that's what I see is, wow, everything is two-party. Why can't I include this constituent? There are regulatory constraints. I know, of course, they're for the right, good reasons. So I think there needs to be more open protocols. This is where we all can work together. You know what I mean? So that, one adversary we have, or two adversaries, death and disease, we can fight them. So.
Do you want to go, Ty?
Yeah, I would maybe love to ground our discussion to legal realities, no pun intended when I say grounding. So the first is, when it comes to AI tools and reimbursement by commercial insurers or Medicare or Medicaid, there's really only one model right now that's currently reimbursed, and that's for diabetic retinopathy because there's so much research behind it. If telehealth during the pandemic is any indication, if there's a true emergency, the federal government or commercial insurers are willing to reimburse for it. But beyond that, it's sort of hard to see long-term reimbursement. We're seeing a lot of the waivers that existed during the pandemic disappear, and we still are struggling for true reimbursement of various telehealth technologies and modalities. That's really one reality where we all agree there's benefit to telehealth. We saw it with our eyes during the pandemic, but reimbursement is just a really hard, difficult road, and I think we'll eventually get there, but I think it's going to take some time, and then a lot of it needs to be grounded on evidence and data for CMS or commercial insurers to do anything. The other part is whether it's this OCR rule that I mentioned, where providers need to, track bias and make sure they're sort of mitigating for it. The overarching group that oversees state medical boards came out with guidance recently saying that providers also need to, there always needs to be a provider in the loop, and providers need to be aware of the technology that they're using, including actual use cases and potential pitfalls of using it. And so there are a lot of expectations being put on providers to accomplish this. But the sentiment, despite that being the state of law, the sentiment that I keep hearing is the standard of care, within the next decade, if you will be that you're potentially committing medical malpractice if you're not using AI tools. So I find there's like a cognitive dissonance there. I find a disconnect between the two, but it seems like there's a lot of expectation being put on providers to know what's going on, but also this recognition in the industry that it is so ubiquitous, it will sort of be part of clinical care, that providers that are left behind do so at your peril.
Yeah,
that's a great point. I would add, just in terms of where I think we're going to be in 20 years is very different from a guideline approach to diagnostics. What do I mean by that? Some of you may not know this, June is Men's Health Month, and we haven't done nearly as much awareness of that, I think, as we could do as a country on men's health. But one thing that I often get asked about is, what about prostate-specific antigen, and who should be screened for PSAs? The age-old controversy on a critical or what some people think is a critical diagnostic for men. Why do I raise that? In 20 years, I suspect, and it's not the case now, but in 20 years, we're going to think very differently about diagnostics. Cholesterol, PSA, the Pranuva scan, full body MRI, all these longevity things that are all the rage. Who should get screened and when? Right now, it's one size fits all, but we know that there's metabolomics, what you eat. There's the environment around you. There's your genetics. And fundamentally, all those things probably impact how many of us should be screened for cholesterol. What age we should start. Not every 5 years, which is what the U.S. Preventive Task Force says. Every 5 years at a certain age, get a cholesterol screen. I would venture a guess that a lot of people do that more often. Some don't do it at all, based on their individual risk, which is more than just family risk. It's what you eat. It's the, again, environment around you, your metabolomics. So in 20 years, I hope we live in a world, maybe in 2 years, where AI is providing all of us a greater visibility as to what we should be doing individually from a diagnostic standpoint. I know it might seem basic, but if you don't know you have a problem, you're not going to seek healthcare in the first place. And I think the guidelines that we have, this very guideline-based approach to chronic disease and screening, doesn't work.
Do you have anything? Okay, well, I just want to thank our panelists, Jay, Blythe, Vin, Ty, for sharing your insights. I personally learned a lot. I think that everyone here has as well. If anybody does have any questions, remember that at your tables or on the back of your badge, you can post those questions that we'll be having at our Q&A session later. But for now, just thank you for joining us, giving us your time and your insights.